All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're taking on a big one, a concept that you hear it everywhere, revolution. But we're going beyond just the usual meaning and we're going to really dig into the philosophical definition. We'll be drawing on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy for this one, that really rigorous academic approach. So yeah, it's like a deep dive to sharpen your philosophical lens for this. I mean, revolution, it's powerful, it's debated, it's all over history.
Absolutely. And coming at this as someone who appreciates philosophy, you know that the everyday use of revolution is pretty broad. It gets thrown around a lot.
Oh, yeah.
So what we're going to try to do here is get to that precise, philosophically grounded understanding. We'll be kind of pulling out like the core of what makes a revolution, the way the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy lays it out. And then from there, explore like the ethics of it all. Because,
Okay.
this is about challenging power structures, potentially overthrowing governments. It's serious stuff.
Yeah, so let's jump right in. So philosophically, when we talk about revolution, it's not just any kind of big change or uprising, right? The entry, right from the start, makes some really important distinctions. So could you walk us through those, like how philosophy separates revolution from, ideas like resistance, rebellion, or secession? Because in everyday talk, those often get kind of mixed up.
That's a great place to start, that clarification.
Yeah.
Because while all of those things involve, going against existing government authority outside of the usual like legal channels, the scope and the goals, they're different. So like resistance, for example. Resistance could be really focused,
Yeah.
like people objecting to one particular law or trying to block a specific policy. It doesn't automatically mean they're rejecting the government's legitimacy altogether. It's more targeted.
Right.
Rebellion, on the other hand, that's a much broader rejection of authority. But those rebelling may not have a clear alternative in mind. Like it could be, we don't want these rulers anymore, but without a plan for what comes next.
So rebellion is more like just no to the current situation, while revolution has that no, ND, here's what should be instead.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
The philosophical definition, at its core, it has those two key parts. First, saying no to the existing government's authority, and then that second part, that attempt to put another government in its place, and usually through force. It's outside the normal constitutional means. That's that positive aim, the intention to create a whole new governing structure.
Yeah.
That's a big part of what separates a true revolution from just a rebellion.
And the entry also talks about constitution in a broader sense, which I thought was really interesting. Like they're not just talking about a formal document.
Right, right. And that's super important to understand this philosophically. See, here, Constitution is more about those basic rules, the way a group figures out how to make decisions together. Like, imagine even a schoolyard clique, right? There are these unspoken rules about who's in charge, how they decide things, even without a written document. That's a kind of constitution in this sense. So a revolution, it could be aiming to overthrow even that kind of underlying power structure, not just a government with a fancy written constitution.
So it's really about those fundamental ways that a society makes decisions, no matter how formal or informal they are. And speaking of fundamental, the entry also talks about stronger and weaker senses of revolution. What's the key difference there, and which one will we be focusing on most for our philosophical exploration today?
So the weaker sense, which will be our main focus, is basically about this: trying to replace one national government with another across the whole territory and doing it outside the normal constitutional ways. That's the core of it. The stronger sense, it takes it further. It's not just replacing the government, but it's changing the whole type of government, like going from a dictatorship to a democracy, that kind of shift. And under this stronger definition, even secession, like a group breaking away to form their own state, that can be seen as revolutionary if they're also making that fundamental change in the type of government.
Yay.
The ethical questions, they get even more intense with that stronger sense, but for clarity, we'll stick mostly to the weaker definition. But just keep in mind, it can definitely cover those big transformative revolutions too.
Got it. And then there's the whole, violent versus nonviolent distinction. Because, yeah, using force is usually a big part of how we define revolution. But the entry does bring up the idea of nonviolent revolution.
It does. And it even points out that, defining violence itself is tricky. Because think about it, even nonviolent tactics, if they're disruptive enough, like a general strike, they can still cause harm. It's not always about physical force in the usual sense. But for today's deep dive, especially when we're getting into the moral arguments, we're mainly going to be looking at those large-scale, violent revolutions, what we might call revolutionary war.
Okay. And the entry even mentions this interesting debate. Which one is more effective, violent or nonviolent revolution for achieving its goals?
Yeah, yeah. And some political scientists, they look at the data and they say, well, actually, statistically, nonviolent revolutions are more likely to succeed. But even if that's true, it doesn't answer the big philosophical question, are there times when nonviolence just won't achieve the goals of a revolution that's justified? Or maybe it would, but at too high a cost, like to people's basic well-being. If there are those exceptions, then we need a theory of just revolutionary war. That becomes a central question in this whole debate.
Okay, so we've got a solid idea of what revolution means philosophically. Now let's get into how philosophers throughout history have thought about the morality of revolution. And it seems like before the modern era, the general view was against it, right?
Yeah, pretty much. You had thinkers like Augustine and Aquinas. They basically condemned rebellion and, by extension, revolution. Their big emphasis was maintaining order, being obedient to the established authorities. Now, Suarez, he was a little more nuanced. He suggested maybe lesser magistrates might have a reason to challenge a ruler, implying that full-blown popular revolution wasn't usually justified. And then there's Hobbes, who was crystal clear. Revolution was never okay except for self-defense if your life is in imminent danger.
Yeah, and then we have Kant. He seems even more strongly opposed to revolution than those who came before him.
Yeah, Kant's rejection of revolution is probably the most absolute of that period. He was like, nope, never justified, no matter how bad the government is, how unjustly they're using power. His argument is really tied to his whole idea of rights. To Kant, rights need a system of law, backed up by the collective will, that's the state, to make sure those rights are applied equally to everyone. Revolution, by its very nature, is people trying to enforce what they think are their rights all by themselves, outside that system. To Kant, that just wrecks the whole legal framework. It has no legitimate authority. So for Kant, the act of revolution itself destroys the possibility of a just legal order. It's a contradiction.
So for Kant, the cure, which is revolution, is basically flawed because it attacks the very system that rights need to exist in the first place. Stability and the rule of law, even if the laws are bad, those seem to be the most important things for him.
That's a great way to sum up his view. His conceptual argument, as it's called, basically says revolutionary acts just can't have real authority, so they're wrong from the get-go. And when you combine that with the undue risk argument, that revolutions can easily fail and lead to anarchy and more violence, you've got a pretty powerful case against revolution.
But of course, the philosophical debate didn't just stop there, right? We start to see counter-arguments popping up that question this absolute condemnation of revolution.
Oh, for sure. By the late 16th century, you see this, especially in France with the monarchical mocks. Thinkers start saying, hold on, there are times when the monarchy itself is unjust. And they start advocating for revolution, even tyrannicide, killing an unjust king.
Wow.
Figures like Francois Hauptmann, he looked to the idea of a national assembly, like the people coming together, as a more legitimate source of power. And then you have the author of Vindici contra Tyrannos. He argued from a religious angle. He said, look, people don't have to obey a king who's violating God's law. They can resist a ruler who isn't doing his divinely ordained duty.
Okay.
And over in Scotland, George Buchanan, he was developing these early ideas of popular sovereignty. Basically, the people have the right to resist, even punish tyrannical rulers. So these are like the early seeds of the idea that maybe, just maybe, there are times when it's right to forcefully challenge an unjust government.
So they're laying the groundwork for more modern justifications. And then comes Locke. His defense of revolution, the liberal defense, that's been hugely influential, right?
Oh, yeah. Locke's defense, it's a turning point.
Huh.
He argued, people have these natural rights just by being human.
Yeah.
And the government's job, first and foremost, is to protect those rights. That's the whole social contract idea. The government holds power as a kind of trustee, looking after those rights for the people.
Right.
But if the government totally fails to do that, if they're systematically violating those natural rights, the contract's broken. That trust is gone.
Right.
And Locke says, at that point, the authority to protect those rights goes back to the people. And in that situation, they have the right to resist, even to revolt. It's like self-defense against an illegitimate power. That's often called the self-defense argument for revolution.
And Locke's view of what happens after a government's overthrown was a bit more hopeful than, say, Hobbes, right? He didn't necessarily see it as automatic chaos and collapse.
Exactly. Locke thought that society itself, like the social fabric, the norms, the ways people cooperate, all that could survive, even if the government structure crumbled. He had a more optimistic view of society's resilience, so he didn't think revolution was as risky as Hobbes did. But the entry makes a good point. Those risks, how likely a society is to fall apart after a revolution, it really depends on the specifics of the situation.
Okay, so context matters. Now, let's shift gears completely and talk about the Marxist view of revolution. It seems like a very different framework from the liberal focus on individual rights that we see with Locke, right?
Oh, totally. It's a huge departure. In some Marxist thinking, the whole idea of rights is actually rejected. Instead, they focus on the dynamics between classes and the ultimate goal of getting rid of human alienation. From this perspective, individual rights are seen as this kind of like tool of the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, and they say it'll become irrelevant once you achieve a communist society. So justifying a proletarian revolution, it's not about defending existing rights, it's about totally changing the economic and social systems that create alienation in the first place. They want to create a society where people can fully realize their potential as creative communal beings.
So it's less about protecting individual freedom. It's more about transforming society for a different kind of flourishing, a collective one.
Right, exactly. But the entry also brings up another way to interpret Marx. It sees him less as a moral philosopher trying to justify revolution and more as a kind of scientific theorist. In this view, the proletarian revolution isn't a moral obligation, it's just historically inevitable. Marx believed that the clash between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, which is driven by economics, would inevitably lead to revolution, regardless of any moral arguments. He was actually quite critical of what he called moralistic or utopian socialists.
So this view is more about explaining why revolution must happen due to these historical forces rather than judging it morally.
Yeah, that's the core of it. He's not saying it's good or bad. He's explaining why it's going to happen. And it's about a change that goes way beyond just the traditional ideas of the state and political structures.
Yeah.
A very different way of thinking about revolution compared to like Locke's focus on rights or even Kant's absolute condemnation of it.
It's amazing to see such different approaches to this question. Now, the entry goes on to explore how the framework of just war theory might apply to revolutionary conflict, specifically looking at jus ad bellum, the justice of resorting to war. So how does this framework, which is usually used to think about wars between states, apply to revolutions?
Well, since revolutions usually involve a lot of violence, it makes sense for philosophers to think about them through that lens of just war theory. And remember, Locke himself framed revolution as a form of self-defense, but it's collective self-defense against a government that's gone bad.
Right, right.
So the just ad bellum criteria, the things that make it okay for a state to go to war, those become relevant for judging whether a revolutionary war is morally permissible.
And the entry makes this really important distinction between what it calls Hobbesian and Lockean contexts. Can you explain what those are and why it matters for just ad bellum?
These are like ideal types. They're about the resources that revolutionaries have, the social and institutional stuff. In a Lockean context, there's already some pretty strong structures, maybe formal institutions or just strong informal networks. And those can help revolutionaries overcome two big problems. One is the cooperation problem, getting enough people on board. And two, the coordination problem, getting them organized effectively. Think about the American Revolution, right? They had those colonial legislatures, communication networks.
Right.
Now, a Hobbesian context, that's where those resources are mostly missing. And that can lead to more division among revolutionaries, a higher chance of uncoordinated violence, and it makes building a stable alternative much harder. Kind of like the early days of the Russian Revolution.
So the existing social and political setup, or lack thereof, really shapes how a revolution unfolds, how violent it gets, and that obviously impacts the just ad bellum considerations.
Exactly. And even more than that, those contexts, they're not static. The entry gives the Iranian Revolution as an example where things shifted, the context changed over time. Yeah. So understanding where a revolution falls on that Hobbesian-Lockean spectrum is super important. Otherwise, you're making these sweeping judgments about how risky or how justified it is without considering the specifics. Someone might think a revolution is more likely to be okay if they assume it's a Lockean context, less risk of the whole society imploding. But someone else, thinking it's Hobbesian, they might see it as just too dangerous and therefore wrong to begin with.
Okay, so context is key. So given that, how do those standard just ad bellum criteria, just cause, proportionality, rightful authority, necessity, how do those apply specifically to revolutionary war? Let's start with just cause.
All right, so right off the bat, the entry sets aside some motives for revolution as just plain wrong, like starting a theocracy that violates people's basic rights or trying to preserve slavery. Those are non-starters. The real question of just revolution comes up in response to what's called a resolute severe tyranny. It's a regime that's consistently and systematically violating basic human rights for a lot of its people. They're authoritarian, and they're not open to any real reform.
Okay.
Now, how justified a revolution against that kind of tyranny would be, it depends on what rights are being violated, right? If it's fundamental survival rights, like the right to life or basic sustenance, that carries more moral weight than, say, just violations of political rights.
Right. That makes intuitive sense.
Yeah.
But the entry also points out this problem, the just aim of a revolution, especially in those Hobbesian situations where the revolutionaries might not all be on the same page.
Yeah, exactly. In those messy Hobbesian situations, you might have a lot of disagreement among those trying to overthrow the government about what they're actually fighting for, what kind of political system they want to create. And the old ways of deciding things, they've been rejected, or they just don't work anymore, and new legitimate ways haven't been set up yet. So this lack of a clear, unified aim, it makes it really hard to judge whether the whole revolution is just or not. It might not even make sense to talk about a single just aim.
Okay.
But there's a useful distinction here. The justification for starting a revolution might be different from the justification for joining one that's already happening. Someone might have good reasons to participate in a revolution, even if the initial goals were unclear or even kind of messed up.
Right. That's an important nuance. Now, what about proportionality? The idea that the good achieved by the revolution has to outweigh all the harm and the costs that come with it.
Yeah, this one's tough, especially with the revolution. Some people argue that political rights, they're just not as important as the right to life and physical security. And those are pretty much always at risk when there's violence. So if a revolution is only about fixing political rights violations, they might say, well, it's not proportional to all the deaths and disruption. Plus, revolutionary violence, it often happens without the direct consent of many of the people it's supposed to be helping, which makes the whole calculation even more complicated.
But there must be arguments against that view, right? It can't be that simple.
Of course not. One counterargument is that even those seemingly lesser rights violations, when they build up over time, they can be hugely damaging, both to individuals and to the whole society, maybe even more damaging in the long run than the short-term harms of a revolution. Plus, even if a revolution only targets what seem like less urgent rights, a successful one could have these ripple effects, It could strengthen those global norms of good governance, respect for human rights. And then there's a responsibility argument. If a regime violates rights, even minor ones, they're partly to blame for the violence that erupts when people try to get those rights back. And fundamentally, you could argue that revolution is responding to this huge moral wrong, a government failing to recognize its citizens as equals. And maybe that outweighs a lot in the proportionality calculation, at least in extreme cases.
And, of course, we have to factor in those Hobbesian contexts we talked about. Because if the revolutionaries have to use force just to get people on their side, that could lead to this whole spiral of escalating violence, right?
Absolutely. Without those structures for coordinating and mobilizing, revolutionaries might feel they have to use coercion to gain and keep support. And that almost always provokes a crackdown from the regime. So the violence escalates, and it gets much harder to say that the revolution is proportional to the harm it's causing. This is a big part of why revolutions, especially the Hobbesian kind, often end up so much more violent than wars between states, and why they can easily descend into chaos. It also makes that traditional just ad bellum idea, having a reasonable chance of success, much harder to figure out.
Let's move on to the rightful authority criterion. This one seems especially tricky with revolution, since the whole point is to challenge the legitimacy of the existing power.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. The traditional understanding of rightful authority, like just war theory, it's all about institutions, democratic elections, constitutional processes, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But obviously, an oppressive regime, they're not going to offer those avenues for a revolution to get legitimacy. The Stanford Encyclopedia entry talks about some scenarios where maybe there is something like rightful authority. Like maybe the leaders of the revolution were elected officials before the oppression got really bad.
Right.
Or maybe the existing constitution actually allows for resistance against tyranny under certain conditions, like some historical declarations have done.
But in more typical Hobbesian situations, where you have this small group deciding to use violence and claiming they represent the people, their rightful authority seems pretty shaky.
It really does. It's hard to see how this small, unelected group can really claim to act for everyone, especially without any legitimate process to give them that authority.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you might have multiple revolutionary groups fighting each other, all claiming legitimacy. It gets messy. The entry even talks about a broader kind of abstract idea of representation, where it's about genuinely being committed to the common good and acting for the people. But they also acknowledge that this is miles away from how we normally understand authority, and it could lead to some real paternalistic problems, people deciding what's best for others without their real consent.
It almost sounds like this whole requirement of rightful authority, the way we use it for wars between states, might not fit neatly with revolutions, especially the Hobbesian kind.
Yeah, that's a radical thought, but it's an important one.
Hmm.
Maybe in those extreme cases where you have really terrible oppression and the state is basically broken down, the real question shouldn't be about whether the revolutionaries have legitimate authority in that moment.
Right.
Maybe it should be. Do their actions have a chance of creating the conditions where rightful authority can exist eventually? Are they working towards a more legitimate order after the old regime's gone? It kind of challenges this direct application of rules from interstate war to these very different revolutionary situations.
Okay, makes sense. Finally, let's talk about the necessity criterion. When is a revolution truly the last resort, the only option left?
The bar for necessity is really high. A revolution's only seen as necessary when the system is so fundamentally broken, so morally wrong, that there's just no way to fix it peacefully.
Right.
That's why the focus is usually on these resolute, severe tyrannies, the kind that have shut down all avenues for peaceful change, not just the official legal channels. And even then, there are other things to try before resorting to revolution. Widespread protests, strikes, all sorts of civil disobedience. Those usually have to be exhausted before you can say, okay, revolution is the only option left. So necessity, it's a really demanding standard, and it's usually only met when you're dealing with truly extreme and hopeless repression.
Right. So we've looked closely at the justice of starting a revolutionary war through jus ad bellum. Now let's turn to jus in bello, the justice and how that war is fought. The main principles here, if I remember right, are proportionality in using tactics and discrimination, protecting non-combatants.
You got it. Jus in bello, that's about what actions are morally acceptable during a conflict, in this case, a revolutionary war. Proportionality means the tactics the revolutionaries use, they have to be likely to actually contribute to the just aims of the revolution. And that contribution has to outweigh the harm and rights violations those tactics cause.
Okay.
Discrimination at its core is about non-combatant immunity, that idea that innocent civilians shouldn't be deliberately targeted. But like the entry points out, in a revolution, it can be really hard to define who counts as an innocent non-combatant. It gets blurry.
And that's where those ethically tricky irregular tactics come in. The things revolutionary groups often do, like assassinating civilians who work for the regime or attacking in disguise or using terrorism.
Yeah, the entry breaks these tactics down into categories, which is helpful. You've got camouflage and disguise, mostly for avoiding detection or gaining an advantage.
Right.
Then you've got human shields, which is horrible, and deliberately targeting non-combatants for strategic reasons. These tactics, they really push the limits of, or just straight up violate, those core jus in bello principles.
Yeah.
Proportionality and discrimination. They put civilians at much higher risk.
And revolutionaries often say they use these tactics because they're so outmatched, right? The regime has better training, equipment, all that. They might struggle to get people to join them, especially if the state controls the information, lots of propaganda. So they see these irregular tactics as a way to even the odds, maybe provoke the regime into brutality so people see their true colors.
Yeah, that's the reality of these asymmetrical conflicts.
Yeah.
Revolutionaries are often at a huge disadvantage in terms of power, resources, organization, and they might think that using violence in these unconventional ways, even tactics that would be condemned in a normal war, is the only way to show they're a force to be reckoned with.
Right.
To expose the regime's brutality and ultimately get more people to support their cause. But while the reasons might be understandable, given the situation, the morality of these tactics is still a huge debate in philosophy.
So let's look at camouflage and disguise, for example. Those seem to clash directly with discrimination, which usually requires soldiers to be identifiable, uniforms, open carrying of weapons.
Exactly. The usual argument against them is that they blur the line between who's a combatant and who's not. So the enemy can't easily tell who to target, and that puts civilians at risk. But some philosophers say, hold on, maybe they are okay under very specific circumstances.
Okay.
Especially in the early stages of a revolution, where the revolutionaries are at a huge disadvantage, and it's not their fault.
Yeah.
The idea is maybe these tactics help restore a little fairness, a bit more balance of power. But they often make a distinction between camouflage, which is mostly for getting away after combat, and disguise during combat. The disguise part is seen as more problematic because it directly messes with the enemy's ability to defend themselves in a way that protects civilians.
What about human shields and deliberately targeting non-combatants? Those seem like much clearer violations of jus in bello.
Yeah, they are. Those tactics are basically using civilian lives as tools for military gain. And most theorists who study these kinds of conflicts say they're absolutely unacceptable. They violate that core principle of non-combatant immunity. Sometimes people bring up the supreme emergency argument, the idea that maybe it's okay if it's literally the only way to prevent some catastrophe if the revolution fails. But most people are very wary of that. It's easy to justify anything as a supreme emergency, and if you start making exceptions, those basic rules of war could completely erode.
The entry then goes on to break down different types of non-combatant targeting: terrorism, expansive discriminate targeting, provocation, and coercion. Can you quickly go over what makes each of those ethically distinct?
Sure. Terrorism, in this context, that's intentionally hitting non-combatants in areas where there's no fighting going on. The goal is to spread terror and weaken support for the regime. Expansive discriminate targeting, that's about deliberately going after specific civilians who are seen as complicit with the oppressive regime. Provocation, that's trying to get the regime to lash out against civilians, hoping that'll make people support the revolution. And coercion, that's using force or threats against civilians to make them help or join the revolution.
It sounds like the risk of things getting out of hand, ethically speaking, is different for each of those.
Yeah, the arguments against these tactics tend to be weaker when it's harder for them to be abused,
Right.
or when the enemy is less likely to just retaliate indiscriminately. And it also matters if the regime is already doing similar or worse things to their own people.
Right.
Like, a revolutionary group might be slightly more inclined to consider expansive discriminate targeting if the regime is already engaging in widespread violence against civilians. But things like terrorism or using human shields, those are almost always condemned because they can so easily lead to indiscriminate harm and things spiraling out of control. Even with expansive discriminate targeting and coercion, that basic principle of non-combatant immunity means there's a strong presumption against them. You need very good reasons to justify them.
The entry mentions some arguments for coercing support under extreme conditions, and even this idea that some non-combatants might lose their protection because they're helping the unjust regime. These are obviously really ethically complex and sensitive areas.
They are. Some philosophers, like Buchanan, have explored the idea that maybe, just maybe, forcing people to support the revolution, kind of like a draft, might be okay in some extreme situations if it's for a really important public good. But only under really strict conditions, having to do with just cause, proportionality, necessity, and making sure the burden is shared fairly. And Finley has this complex argument that some non-combatants, if they're actively helping an oppressive regime, they might lose their usual protection. But again, only if harming them is truly necessary and proportional to achieving the just goals of the revolution.
Right.
The big problem is, how do you define what counts as actively helping? What level of contribution makes someone lose that protection? That's a huge debate.
This whole discussion really shows how morally complicated revolutionary war is, especially when you think about the ethics of how it's actually fought. Now, the last big area the Stanford Encyclopedia entry covers is intervention by foreign actors in revolutions.
Yeah, intervention, that means deliberate military help from outside. It could be troops, weapons, no-fly zones, intelligence, logistics, training, all sorts of things. And it can be absolutely decisive for revolutions, especially given that power imbalance we talked about. But justifying intervention, that's ethically tricky. Michael Walzer, for example, he's famous for arguing that there should be really strict limits on intervention based on the idea of self-determination. He basically said that uninvited military intervention is only okay in truly extreme cases, like to stop a genocide, that kind of emergency. So his view creates this big gap between when a revolution might be justified internally and when it's okay for outsiders to step in and help militarily.
But Buchanan has some counter-arguments to that very limited view.
Right. He does. Buchanan questions whether you always need clear popular support or consent from the people you're trying to help, especially when you're dealing with a really oppressive regime. It's hard to get genuine consent when people are being silenced. He argues that sometimes intervention can be justified based on proportionality, if it's likely to prevent even worse things from happening, or if it helps create conditions where those oppressed people can actually express their will freely. He also argues that even the principle of self-determination can sometimes support intervention. Like, if the goal is to protect or create the conditions where people can truly govern themselves in the long run, even thinking about future generations.
And Buchanan seems to be saying there might be more overlap between when a revolution is justified from the inside and when it's okay for others to help from the outside.
Yeah, while Walser emphasizes that asymmetry, Buchanan and others, they suggest there might be more symmetry. They're like, look, if the revolution itself is morally okay, given the oppression, then helping that revolution succeed under certain conditions might also be okay. But you have other philosophers like Renzo, who, while he also emphasizes self-determination as a limit on intervention, he argues for a different kind of symmetry. He says those revolutionary groups who claim to be acting for the people, they can actually undermine self-determination just as much as foreign interveners can.
Interesting.
And Finley has this complementary view. He sees intervention as a way to support a legitimate revolution. It's okay if the people trying to secure their rights just can't do it on their own, and their leaders need outside help to succeed.
So the ethics of intervening in a revolution, it's just as complex and debated as the ethics of the revolution itself. Now, the entry wraps up by looking at what all this means for future research in philosophy on this topic. What are some key takeaways for philosophers who are still working on this stuff?
The entry really emphasizes that when you're judging both revolution and intervention, you have to think about the facts on the ground, especially the likely consequences. Whether or not it's justified, a lot of the time it comes down to this. Does the chance of a better outcome outweigh all the harm and the costs that come with violence and instability? And with intervention, there's the added question of, is getting involved from the outside actually going to do more good than harm?
Right.
They also point out that a lot of the disagreement between those who absolutely condemn revolution and those who say, well, it might be okay in extreme situations, it boils down to how much risk they think is involved. And as we've discussed, that level of risk, it depends heavily on the context. Is it more Hobbesian or more Lockean?
So it sounds like any good theory of revolution has to go.